This is a story called Masquerade by Apple Juice under the subreddit Short Stories. The night was silent, until it wasn't. Penny tossed and turned in her sleeping bag, trying to get comfortable on the hard ground. She was never fond of camping. She could never sleep. She closed her eyes, trying to force herself to go to bed, when she heard it. The music. A slow and steady waltz. Penny rose from her sleeping bag. That's strange. I thought Mom and Dad said we were hours away from town, she wondered to herself. And who would be playing a waltz in the middle of the night? She groaned and laid back down. But as she listened to the music, she became more and more curious. It felt familiar somehow, pulling on her, saying, "Follow me." Before she knew what she was doing, she had her boots laced, flashlight in hand, and left the safety of the campsite. She wandered through the woods, following the alluring music. It was a breezy summer night, the full moon illuminating everything Penny's flashlight didn't touch. The forest was completely silent, but for the sound of Penny's footsteps over pine needles, and the alluring melody, growing closer and closer. She pushed past an evergreen bush into a clearing where an ancient cathedral stood. It rose high above the trees. Penny was surprised she hadn't seen it coming, with its remaining spires being as tall as they were. The columns surrounding the outside of the old building were worn and cracked from many years of weathering. Half of the roof was missing, completely caved in. As Penny approached, she noticed a statue of a saint in front of the main archway, his face and fingers cracked off, trailing ivy growing up the base. The music was deafening now, like an orchestra was playing right beside her. She saw a glint of warm light from inside the building. Turning off her flashlight, she approached the archway leading into the main hall. There, among cracked stone and cobweb-covered pews, was a single lit candle. She went to it, feeling drawn, as if by a spell. She stepped over the threshold, 1 foot at a time, and as she did, the old hall changed before her eyes. The ceiling was no longer cracked and caved in. Instead, it was tall and vaulted, with chandeliers of blood-red stones dangling down. Intricate sconces of gold filigree with red candles hung from the walls. Tall windows were inset into the carved stone, framed by wine-colored curtains. The floor was changed to a glossy black marble, as if by magic. And it turned out it was magic. Across the hall was a grand orchestra, their instruments made of wood so glistening it might be mistaken for gold. They played a magnificent waltz for the masked dancers, spinning and twirling across the marble, with intricate gowns, insectoid wings, and beastly masks. Penny was so stunned that she dropped her flashlight. It clanged on the perfect marble floor, but no one batted an eye. She turned around to the archway she had come from, but instead of a crumbling stone arch, there were black doors, closed, as if she was the last guest, fashionably late to the ball. She turned back around to the graceful dancers and noticed a few long tables to the left of the dance floor. They were draped with red and black tablecloths and laden with strange food. She smelled the sweetness of the cakes, the saltiness of the broth, and the sharp tinge of alcohol. But as she stepped closer, she could tell this food was foreign, unnatural, magical. The dishes just barely resembled human food, unusual pink and green desserts with dripping black icing, roasted vegetables that looked as if from an alien world, and a broiled animal of some kind basted with a mysterious red syrup. Suddenly, Penny's stomach lurched. It twisted in knots like she hadn't eaten in days. She rested a hand on the food table, reaching for a dessert, her mouth watering for a delicacy she had never even seen before. As her fingers touched the plate carrying the weird cake, she hesitated. This is a magical ball. These desserts are obviously made for the strange guests. She paused. What even are these people? She examined the closest dancer, a tall, slender woman in a rouge gown. She actually looked relatively normal, if not for the second pair of eyes dotting her raised cheekbones and the spindly antennae that sprouted from her forehead. Insect-like features, flawless skin, enchanting voice. These may just be fairies, she reasoned to herself. Didn't the fairy tales grandmother always read say never to eat or drink anything of the fae? She turned back to the little cake. Her stomach fought back, trying to reason with her. She was so hungry. She had never been this hungry before in her life. As her mind and appetite were warring, she didn't notice the person behind her. "Hello there," a curious voice said. Penny whipped her head around as if she'd been caught where she didn't belong. Technically, she didn't. She was met with striking green eyes, warm skin, and hair as fair as spider silk. He towered over her, but leaned down to her level in a kind way, not condescending, as most people taller than her did. He wore an exquisite suit of black velvet with red embroidery depicting thorns and bright red rosebuds, as well as a matching red and black mask that looked like a butterfly with its wings spread. When she looked him up and down, she noticed that he had wings of a dragonfly, long and shining and delicate, and cleft hooves in place of feet. He tilted his head at her, and that's when she noticed that she had spent the past few seconds staring at him in complete silence. Hello," she responded, and it came out in a mumble. He kept looking at her. She was afraid he might not have heard her. She opened her mouth to repeat herself when a soft smile came across his face. Her stomach growled furiously, and Penny's face flushed red, embarrassed. The man's smile faltered, just a tiny bit, before coming back over his face in full force. "I see you're hungry," he stated, reaching for the plate she was going for before. He cut into the cake, a bite of fluffy pink on the end of a gilded fork, and held it out to her. "Please, have some." She stared at him, then she stared at the cake. She knew she shouldn't eat it. She had a sinking feeling that something terrible might happen to her if she did. But this man seemed so lovely, and her stomach argued with her every second she stood and stared at it. She leaned forward, took a bite of weird cake in her mouth, and started to chew. It was the strangest dessert she'd ever had. It tasted sweet and salty simultaneously, almost like caramel popcorn, but earthier and nuttier. The aftertaste was so sickeningly sweet that she knew she would need a sip of water afterward. But once she swallowed, her hunger dissipated entirely, and the sweetness left her mouth. The fairy man spoke up. "I don't think I've ever met you before, and I make it my duty to know everyone who enters my parties," he said, his voice melodic and friendly. He sat the plate back on the table, turning to her with full attention. Your parties?" she asked, bewildered. What a strange and gracious host. He nodded and chuckled, a light, airy sound that suggested he thoroughly enjoyed himself. Although, how could he? She was just a human girl in ragged pajamas who just so happened to stumble into his party. Penny looked around at the inhuman dancers and the extravagant setting of the party. After a pause, she asked, "Is all of this real?" She knew her imagination, and it could have easily dreamt up all of this. Part of her sort of hoped that it did. The stranger's smile widened. "As real as it gets," he said, his green eyes sparkling. Penny's curiosity got the best of her as she watched him, his wings flitting like a bug's and his hooves clicking on the marble. "What kind of a party is this exactly?" she asked, looking out at the men with pointy ears and long curling horns, and the green-skinned ladies in large hoop skirts. This stranger and his guests were obviously not human, but were they really fairies, or just ornately costumed? Yes, maybe this was a costume party, or some sort of prank. "It's a gathering of my court. The elves, the pixies, the sprites, all the creatures of my kingdom in the other world," the stranger said, seemingly glad to tell her all about him and his people. Now this confirmed it. It was an otherworldly affair. Penny instantly regretted coming here, eating the cake, talking to this ferryman, who was actually a king. She had to find some way to leave and get back home, while being as polite as possible. After all, the Fae were easily offended. She gasped, an idea forming. "Oh, I wasn't invited. I didn't mean to intrude on your party, sir." He laughed again, leaning in closer. "Sir? Please, call me Finvara. And as for your invitation, I'll make an exception for you. There's no reason to kick out a lovely girl who just so happened to wander in." Penny's confidence faltered. Her idea for escape shot down. "Actually, I'm quite glad you did. I don't have a partner to dance with. Would you like to?" he asked, holding out his hand to her. Just as she felt pulled to oblige, her mind rang with caution. She recalled what the story said would happen if you danced with fairies. you would never return home. You would dance with them forever until you withered away. Penny looked back at him, his hand outstretched, eager to dance with her, the shy redhead in pajamas, of all people. She could tell now that, just like the hunger, this flattery she felt was clearly some sort of magic, pulling her to do Finvara's bidding. She weighed her options and made her decision. Yes, I'd love to dance. Her hands clamped hard over her mouth. That was not what she had wanted to say. It felt like something came up her throat and forced her tongue to move against her will. Just a fluke. She cleared her throat to try again. She started, already forming the sentence in her head. I'm sorry, but I have to decline. Yes, I'd like to dance with you. What is going on? She was starting to sweat. She wiped her brow, preparing to try and correct herself a third time, when Finvara spoke. Splendid. He looked pleased, and Penny wondered if he knew this would happen. Of course he knew this would happen, she yelled at herself. He's a fairy king. He took her hand from her side, not even bothering to offer his first. She tried to wiggle from his grasp, but it was no use. It seemed that whatever magic was making her speak in opposites was also affecting her motor functions. She meandered after him, having little to no control over her limbs. Halfway to the dance floor, Finvara turned and stopped, his face lighting up as if he'd forgotten something. Oh, your clothes. It completely slipped my mind, he said in a sing-song voice. Then he waved his hands at her, like a child playing wizards. It took a confusing second before Penny realized that when he'd waved his hands, her old graphic t-shirt and pajama shorts magically, astoundingly, turned into a ball gown. A full ball gown of black lace fitted with hoop skirts, petticoats, and golden buttons trailing from a high neckline. She would have loved the dress if it weren't for the circumstances. She tried moving again for good measure, but alas, when she attempted to turn for the large doors leading outside, her feet stayed glued to the pristine marble. She cursed to herself. Much better, Finvara muttered, retaking her hand and leading her out among the other dancers. He placed one hand in hers and the other on her waist. Her limbs moved into position on their own, though she kept struggling for freedom. The orchestra struck up a new waltz. It was slow and melancholy. It perfectly matched Penny's mood. As they danced, her not even stepping on his feet, which told her that this was definitely a spell, she noticed her fingers getting tingly. Within the next few seconds, her entire forearm felt like it had fallen asleep. Then her legs got cold. She started tripping over her feet, even though she was still under the strange spell. After a full minute from the start of the dance, her limbs had gone frigid. She shivered uncontrollably, her mind starting to go as numb as her limbs. Using whatever brain power she had left, she tried to think of a way to break free. Every second she spent dancing, the spell seemed to take away more of her body. She tripped over her foot again. When she glanced up, Finvara looked down at her, a smug smile on his lips. Yes, he definitely knew what he was doing. He then looked around at the other dancers, his subjects, obviously trying to gain their approval. At that moment, she realized that he was a cruel man, and that he only cared about himself. He only cares about himself. And then the idea hit her. As she stood and started dancing again, her body moving on its own, Finvara stared into her eyes. He knew what she was feeling. He had probably done it to hundreds of other human girls. She vowed that she wouldn't be as mindless as them. After all, she knew his weakness. Are you enjoying yourself? Finvara asked, a malicious smirk crossing his masked features. This was her chance. Yes. No, the words escaped her. The truth. Finvara's face turned sour. I want to stay forever, and never leave your side. I want to be rid of whatever spell you put on me. I want to leave and never see your face again. This time, his face turned to a scowl, then enraged, as he noticed the other dancers had stopped and were now observing them curiously. His hands left hers, and he practically jumped away from her, like she was poisonous. She stayed perfectly stationary, still under the spell, although her body grew colder and colder. Finvara glanced around at the other dancers. He coughed and straightened the lapels of his suit. He looked at her with such a hatred, such a look of dismay, that she would have physically recoiled if not for the spell. He looked her in the eyes and sighed. Fine then, go. He waved his hands at her again. like he had with the dress. A few seconds passed. She tried to move, but still couldn't. Just when she thought that he was playing a cruel joke on her, the dizziness started to set in. The ballroom spun in sickening circles. She fell to the ground, surrounded by the strange fairy dancers. The last thing she saw before her eyes closed was Finvara's gaze, as if saying, "I had so much planned for you. What a pity." And then darkness. She awoke with her back on the cracked stone of the cathedral's main hall, her face upward to the caved-in ceiling, observing the brightening sky. Daybreak, but it was not too early for anyone to be up, worrying about where she had been. She willed herself to get up, stumbling to her feet like her limbs were still numb. Sadly, she wasn't in her dress anymore, and the ballroom had made its transformation back into an ancient cathedral. She was just glad that she hadn't left a glass slipper. She could still see Finvara's face in her head, so handsome and kind and fake, so sickeningly fake, like the little pink dessert. She promised herself that she would pay more attention to grandmother's fairy tales, for her own good, and that she would pretend that the ballroom, the dancers, the cake, and Finvara were all a dream, a terrifying dream, one that you take guidance from after waking. She walked to the crumbling archway, her boots echoing on the old stone, grabbed her flashlight from where she had dropped it, and fled into the woods.